Hello everyone and welcome back to Cryptid Horror Stories. I know many of you use these videos to sleep. So before you fall asleep, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Story 1. The small town of Ashwood was a quiet place. Nestled deep within the woods, it was a place where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a steady, predictable pace. That was until the howls started. It was a sound that would rise from the depths of the darkened forest each night, filling the air with an eerie, mournful cry that sent chills down the spines of even the bravest souls. The locals would try to shrug it off at first, blaming coyotes or wolves, but they soon realized it was something far worse, something unnatural. The howls were getting louder, more frequent, and more disturbing by the night. Livestock began to disappear. At first, it was a single chicken here, a goat there. But as the weeks went on, the animals became larger. Pigs, cows, and even horses. The farmers were beside themselves, unable to explain the vanishing livestock. No sign of predators, no traces of claws or fangs, just the eerie silence in the early hours of the morning when they would find their animals gone. The town's sheriff, a burly man named Carl Bennett, took a keen interest in the matter. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, one who dealt with everything from petty thefts to the occasional bar brawl. But this was something different. He couldn't explain it. His officers had set up traps and cameras, but no evidence was ever found. No footprints, no blood trails. It was as though the animals were simply vanishing into thin air. But the howling continued, louder each night. The people of Ashwood began to fear the darkness. They locked their doors early, and some even refused to go out after sunset. But one man, a local farmer named Thomas Caldwell, could not live in fear any longer. His cattle were gone, his livelihood destroyed, and he was determined to find the source of the strange howling. It was on the night of the full moon that Thomas decided to venture into the woods. He grabbed his rifle and set out, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard the stories, the warnings from the older folk who whispered of creatures in the forest that no man should ever cross. But Thomas wasn't one to back down. Not now. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. As he walked deeper into the woods, the howling began again, piercing the silence like a knife. It was closer now, much closer. His breath quickened, and his grip tightened around his rifle. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but it wasn't what he encountered. As he approached a clearing, he saw them. A pack of creatures, twisted and grotesque, gathered around a fire. At first he thought they were wolves, huge, monstrous wolves, but as he drew closer, his blood ran cold. These were no wolves. The creatures stood on two legs, their bodies covered in matted fur, their faces a grotesque blend of human and animal. Their eyes glowed a faint yellow in the moonlight, and their mouths were filled with rows of sharp, yellow teeth. But what horrified Thomas the most was the sound, the howling that had been tormenting the town for weeks. It was coming from them. They weren't just howling, they were speaking, communicating in low growls and snarls. And then he saw it. A figure crouched near the fire, its hands bound in twisted, raw leather. A man. His face was gaunt, eyes wide with fear and madness. His hair was wild, his body thin and trembling. Thomas's stomach turned as the man's head snapped toward him, his eyes wide with terror. "Run!" the man screamed, his voice hoarse and broken. "Get out of here. They'll make you one of them." Before Thomas could react, the creatures turned toward him, their eyes narrowing in unison. They stood, towering over him with a hunger that sent a wave of icy dread through his chest. The man began to struggle, trying to free himself from the ropes that bound him. "You don't understand," he gasped. "They're making us one of them. The pack. They turn us into dogsmen." His voice cracked as he choked on the words. "It's the howl. It's how they do it. They call us, they lure us in, and then they change us into one of them. Thomas took a step back, his mind racing. He had heard rumors, old folk tales told by his grandmother when he was a boy, stories of a cursed pack of beasts that could transform humans into monstrous creatures. But he never believed them. Not until now. The creatures snarled, their eyes locked on Thomas with a ferocity that made his knees buckle. The man at the fire let out a desperate scream. "It's too late. They'll take you too. You'll become one of them. You'll howl for them, and you'll hunt with them, and you'll never be human again." Suddenly, the pack lunged toward him, their claws outstretched, their mouths snapping. Thomas barely had time to raise his rifle before they were upon him. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the forest, but it was drowned out by the sound of the howling, now deafening in his ears. He fired again and again, each shot hitting its mark, but the creatures didn't stop. They kept coming, relentless. In a blur of motion, the largest of the dogsmen leaped at him, knocking the rifle from his hands. It was on top of him in an instant, its sharp claws sinking into his flesh, dragging him down to the ground. The last thing Thomas saw before everything went dark was the pack closing in, their eyes glowing with hunger and malice. The next morning, the sun rose over Ashwood, casting a warm glow over the town. But something was different. There was no sound of the howling. The birds chirped, the wind rustled through the trees, and all seemed peaceful. But then the sheriff received a call. A local farmer was missing, his house empty and untouched. The only thing left behind was his rifle, discarded in the woods near the edge of the forest. And if you listened closely, you could hear the faintest sound of a howl in the distance, one that didn't quite sound like a wolf. Weeks later, the town would slowly return to normal. The howls stopped, the animals ceased disappearing, and the townsfolk would go about their lives, never speaking of the horrors that had occurred in the woods. But there were whispers that the dogsmen still roamed the forest, that they still hunted under the cover of darkness. And if you listened closely enough, on a moonless night, you could hear the faintest sound of howling, coming from deep within the woods. And sometimes, just sometimes, it would sound as if there was a human voice in the pack, a voice that once belonged to a man named Thomas Caldwell. Story number 2. Tom Rayner had always loved the wilderness, the quiet of nature, the stillness of the trees, the fresh scent of pine, and the serenity of being alone. These were the things he treasured most. A seasoned hiker and nature enthusiast, he had explored forests, mountains, and valleys across the country, but none quite as remote as the one he had ventured into now. The wilderness surrounding Hollow Creek was known for being untouched, wild, and mysterious. Many locals in the nearby town spoke of the place in hushed tones, warning outsiders not to stray too far off the beaten path. There were rumors, whispers really, of strange happenings in those woods, but Tom, ever the skeptic, brushed them off as superstitions. The deeper into the forest he went, the more the beauty and isolation wrapped around him like a comforting blanket. But by mid-afternoon, a thick mist began to roll in, blotting out the sun and casting an eerie gloom over the trees. Tom paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the landscape. The fog was unsettling, thick, like it had a life of its own. It clung to the trunks of trees and hung low over the forest floor, weaving in and out of the shadows. He was now miles from the trail, and although he had a map and compass, the disorienting fog made it impossible to tell which direction he was headed. He set off again, pushing through the mist, his boots crunching over the soft earth. But soon, something started to feel wrong. A prickle of unease crept up his spine, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. He shook it off, telling himself it was just the isolation playing tricks on his mind. Then, he saw it. A figure in the distance, standing motionless behind a cluster of trees. It was tall, too tall, and had a strange, hunched posture. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he squinted, trying to make sense of it. At first, he thought it was a bear, but then the figure moved. It was quick, fluid, like it was part of the mist itself. And when it turned toward him, The flicker of pale animal eyes caught the light for just a moment, sending a wave of dread crashing over him. Tom took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet remained glued to the ground. The figure disappeared into the mist with unnatural speed, leaving nothing behind but the faintest trace of a shadow. He stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's just your mind playing tricks, Tom," he thought. "Nothing to be afraid of." But the uneasy feeling had settled deep in his gut, a gnawing sensation that wouldn't go away. As he resumed his hike, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. A faint rustling sound, like a breeze through the trees, but deeper, something that moved with purpose. His eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow, but every time he turned, there was nothing. Just the shifting mist, the silent forest, and the growing sense of being watched. Then, as the afternoon light began to fade, the trees seemed to shift. It wasn't the wind. Tom could feel the air grow still, the atmosphere thickening, suffocating in its quiet. The shadows between the trees grew deeper, longer. They stretched unnaturally, as if they were alive, reaching out toward him. His breath quickened. The shadows, they were moving, but not the trees. It wasn't the trees at all. In the deepening gloom, he saw them again. Figures, the same strange, half-human, half-dog shapes. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the dim light. Tom's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figures were not like any animal he had ever seen, nor were they human in the way he understood. They were something in between, something twisted, monstrous, and far too intelligent. As his feet stumbled backwards, he could hear their breathing, low and guttural, almost like growling. They were not just watching him now. They were moving closer, circling him. He could feel their presence pressing in from all sides, closing in. Tom's pulse thudded in his ears as he slowly realized the terrifying truth. The shadows weren't just following him. They were mimicking him. Every time he took a step, the shadows took one in perfect synchronicity. When he stopped, they stopped. When he moved his arm, they mirrored his movement, their figures stretching and twisting unnaturally, as though they were an extension of his own body, twisted into something far darker. Tom's mind raced. No, this can't be happening. They're not real. They were something in between, something twisted, monstrous, and far too intelligent. As his feet stumbled backwards, he could hear their breathing, low and guttural, almost like growling. They were not just watching him now. They were moving closer, circling him. He could feel their presence pressing in from all sides, closing in. Tom's pulse thudded in his ears as he slowly realized the terrifying truth. The shadows weren't just following him. They were mimicking him. Every time he took a step, the shadows took one in perfect synchronicity. When he stopped, they stopped. When he moved his arm, they mirrored his movement, their figures stretching and twisting unnaturally, as though they were an extension of his own body, twisted into something far darker. Tom's mind raced. No, this can't be happening. They're not real. They can't be real. His legs were frozen, and the more he struggled, the more the shadows shifted and mimicked his every motion. If he ran, they would run. If he hid, they would find him. There was nowhere to escape. The figure closest to him, a grotesque creature with the body of a man but the head of a wolf, stepped forward, its eyes burning with a predatory hunger. It tilted its head slightly as if studying him. Tom could feel the cold weight of its gaze. It was like looking into the eyes of pure malice. And then, a low growl vibrated the air. The creature's lips peeled back to reveal sharp, yellowed teeth. It stepped closer, its paws making a sickening sound on the wet ground. Tom took a shaky step back, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind screamed for him to run, but the shadows were too strong. They wouldn't let him go. They had already begun to take him. A flicker of desperation surged within him. He had to outsmart them, had to trick them. Without thinking, he raised his hand. The shadows mirrored him, their twisted forms following suit. Slowly, he lowered his hand, and with it, the shadows did the same. Then, in one swift motion, he jerked his arm to the side and sprinted in the opposite direction, his legs pumping with every ounce of adrenaline he could muster. The shadows hesitated, thrown off for a fraction of a second. That was all the time he needed. As he ran, he could hear the sounds of the figures behind him, heavy footfalls, the snap of twigs, and the occasional growl. They were closing in, but Tom didn't dare look back. He couldn't. The shadows were still mimicking his every move, but now he had a head start. The mist grew thicker around him, blurring his vision. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow stretched toward him, reaching, grasping, pulling. But he couldn't stop now, not until he was out of this cursed forest. Finally, as the night deepened, Tom stumbled upon an old trail, a narrow, overgrown path that seemed to lead toward the distant glow of town lights. The sounds of the forest, of the shadows, faded with every step he took. He didn't look back. He couldn't. By the time Tom emerged from the forest, gasping for air and drenched in sweat, the shadows were gone. The forest behind him was quiet, as though nothing had ever happened. Not until he was out of this cursed forest. Finally, as the night deepened, Tom stumbled upon an old trail, a narrow, overgrown path that seemed to lead toward the distant glow of town lights. The sounds of the forest, of the shadows, faded with every step he took. He didn't look back. He couldn't. By the time Tom emerged from the forest, gasping for air and drenched in sweat, the shadows were gone. The forest behind him was quiet, as though nothing had ever happened. But deep inside, he knew the truth. The creatures, the shadows, they were still there, and they were waiting. As he limped back into the safety of the town, he realized one chilling fact. The creatures had not only mimicked his every move, they had learned him, and that meant they would be back. He just hoped he'd be ready. Story number 3. It was said that no one who ventured onto Blood Moon Ridge ever came back the same. Those few who did return were changed, haunted by nightmares, their eyes wild with terror, and for good reason. The mountain ridge was known for its unsettling blood-red moons, a phenomenon that occurred once every month, casting an eerie crimson glow over the landscape. Some believed it was an ancient curse, while others claimed it was the work of darker forces. A group of 5 friends, Adrian, Claire, Jonah, Sarah, and Marcus, had heard the stories. They were thrill seekers, adventurers by nature, always looking for the next great mystery. When they learned of the Blood Moon Ridge legend, they couldn't resist. They would make the trek, investigate the strange occurrences, and maybe even document their findings for a documentary. They were determined to uncover the truth behind the cursed ridge. They arrived at the base of the mountain ridge in the early evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense forest. The air had a strange heaviness to it, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. They unloaded their gear, setting up tents and campfires in a small clearing. The ridge loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged and foreboding, as though it was watching them. As the evening wore on, the moon began to rise, casting its pale, silvery light across the land. But as the night deepened, something strange happened. The moon began to shift in color, turning from a soft white to a dark, blood-red hue. The friends gathered around the campfire, eyes wide in disbelief as they watched the sky change. This can't be real," Jonah muttered, his voice a mix of awe and fear. "I've heard about the Blood Moon Ridge curse, but I thought it was just a story, some kind of local folklore." "No, it's real," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I can feel it. Something's wrong." As the blood-red moon rose higher in the sky, an eerie stillness settled over the ridge. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, fell silent, replaced by an unnatural quiet that made the air feel thick and oppressive. "We should head back," Marcus said, his tone uneasy. "This feels wrong, like we're being watched." But it was too late. They had wandered too far. The moment the moon reached its zenith, a low, guttural howl echoed through the woods, freezing them in place. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, deep and chilling, with a hint of something almost human. Before they could react, the forest around them erupted into movement. Figures darted between the trees, shadows flitting just out of their reach. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the darkened woods, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His breath caught in his throat as he finally caught sight of the creatures. They were monstrous, half human, half animal, with long, sharp claws and fur-covered bodies. Their eyes glowed an eerie yellow, reflecting the crimson moonlight. The air around them seemed to shimmer with a malevolent energy. The dogsmen had arrived. The creatures circled the group, moving with a terrifying fluidity, their low growls sending shivers down their spines. The friends backed toward the campfire, trying to keep their distance, but no matter how they moved, the creatures seemed to anticipate their every step. "We need to get out of here," Claire screamed, panic rising in her voice. "Run!" But as they turned to flee, another howl split the air, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps pounding the ground. The pack was closing in, surrounding them. Adrian could hear their breath, raspy and labored, like something more than just beasts. "Stay together," Marcus shouted, trying to form some kind of plan. But it was hopeless. The creatures were everywhere. Adrian's mind raced, trying to find a way out. He glanced at the others. Sarah was already trembling, her face pale with terror. Jonah was clutching his camera, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely keep it steady. It was clear they weren't prepared for something like this. The largest of the dogsmen stepped forward, its eyes locked onto Adrian. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its form covered in thick matted fur. Its face was a grotesque mixture of human and wolf, with a twisted snarl on its lips. The creature sniffed the air and then growled, its yellow eyes narrowing in hunger. Before Adrian could react, the creature lunged, its claws raking through the air toward him. With a desperate cry, he dodged to the side. Barely escaping the blow, he stumbled back toward the fire, his heart pounding. The others weren't so lucky. Sarah was the first to fall. One of the dogsmen was upon her in an instant, its claws sinking deep into her shoulder. Her scream echoed through the woods, sharp and raw, as the creature dragged her into the darkness. Claire cried out in horror, but she was frozen, unable to move. "We have to fight back," Adrian yelled, his voice cracking. He grabbed a heavy branch from the ground, wielding it like a makeshift weapon, and swung it at the nearest creature. The blow landed with a sickening thud, but it had little effect. The dogsman snarled and stepped back, unfazed. Jonah, still holding his camera, stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. One of the dogsmen lunged at him, its claws raking through the air, and before anyone could react, Jonah was gone. The pack had already descended on him, dragging him into the woods as his screams faded into the night. Adrian's mind was a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. They were being picked off one by one. The blood-red moon hung in the sky above them like a silent observer, casting an otherworldly glow over the scene, as if the ridge itself was complicit in the nightmare. Desperation clawed at him. He knew they couldn't fight the dogsmen, not head-on. The creatures were too strong, too fast. But there was one thing he could try: the ritual. The locals had warned them about the ritual that took place on Blood Moon Ridge. Every full moon the dogsmen would hunt, but they didn't just kill. No, they had a purpose, a dark, twisted ritual. They turned their prey into one of them, one of the pack. That was why the moon turned red. It was the symbol of their transformation. If they were going to survive, they would have to break the curse before it was too late. Adrian scanned the forest, his eyes wild with panic. He had to stop them before they got to Claire and Marcus. He had to. He remembered the old stories, tales of a hidden altar deep within the ridge, a place where the ritual could be undone if one was brave enough to find it. Adrian wasn't sure if he believed in such things, but at that moment, he would cling to any hope. "Claire," he shouted, his voice hoarse, "we need to run. Follow me." With every ounce of strength left in his body, he turned and sprinted through the woods, Claire and Marcus close behind. The howls of the dogsmen echoed behind them, and for a fleeting moment, Adrian felt the weight of the curse closing in. They ran through the night, desperate to escape the ridge, to break the curse before the blood-red moon set and the ritual could be completed. But they weren't sure if they could outrun the pack, or if they were already too late. As the first light of dawn began to break over the ridge, Adrian and Claire reached the edge of the woods. They stumbled out of the trees, gasping for breath, but Marcus was not with them. And deep in the forest, the blood-red moon slowly faded. Adrian turned to Claire, his heart sinking. We need to go back for him," he whispered, but he knew it was pointless. There was no going back now. The curse of Blood Moon Ridge had claimed another victim, and the pack was still hunting. Story number 4. The Arctic was a place of extremes, vast, desolate, and unforgiving. Its endless white landscapes stretched as far as the eye could see, a frozen world where life seemed to have been suspended for centuries. Dr. Evelyn Hurst and her team of researchers had been sent to the remote base, situated just north of the Arctic Circle, to study the remains of a prehistoric forest discovered beneath the ice. Ancient trees, frozen in time, were thought to have once thrived here during a warm period long before humankind had even existed. It was a scientific discovery that could offer unprecedented insights into Earth's past. The team, consisting of biologists, paleontologists, and geologists, had been in the region for several weeks, carefully excavating the remains of trees and plant life, studying the ancient flora encased in the permafrost. It was cold beyond comprehension, but the work was fascinating. The forest had been perfectly preserved, its frozen trunks and leaves offering up a secret history that no one had dared to imagine. But it wasn't just the trees that caught their attention. One afternoon, as Dr. Hurst and her colleague, Dr. Jacob Pearson, dug through the frozen earth near a particularly ancient grove, they uncovered something odd: a skull. At first, they thought it was the skull of a prehistoric animal, perhaps an ancient bear or wolf, but when they carefully unearthed it, they realized it was far more unusual. It was a canine skull, but it was unlike anything they had seen before. The skull was unnaturally large, its shape warped in a way that suggested it wasn't just an ordinary predator from the past. The bone structure was thick and sturdy, the teeth unnervingly sharp, and there were subtle hints of something more intelligent in its features. "This doesn't make sense," Jacob muttered, running his fingers over the skull. "This doesn't look like any species we know. What the hell is this?" Dr. Hurst stared at the skull, her mind racing. It's ancient, but it's not just a fossil. Something's wrong about this. We need to take it back to the base. It's too important to leave behind. The team transported the skull back to their research base, a remote facility built into the icy landscape, protected by thick walls of concrete and steel. They carefully stored it in a secure lab, eager to analyze it further. But that night, something changed. It started with a low, unsettling howl. It wasn't like the cries of wolves they had heard in their studies. It was deeper, more guttural. It reverberated through the icy wilderness, so low and constant that it seemed to come from the earth itself. At first, the team dismissed it as the sound of the wind or some other natural phenomenon. But as the nights wore on, the howls grew louder, closer, and they were no longer coming from the distant wilderness. They were right outside the base. On the second night after the howl began, the team's radios malfunctioned. Static filled the air, and the temperature inside the facility dropped dramatically, even though the base's heating systems were fully functional. Everyone huddled together, trying to figure out what was happening. But the howls only grew louder, and something else, something far worse, began to unfold. Dr. Hurst was the first to see them. She had gone out into the snow, checking the perimeter of the base for any signs of wildlife. The sky was covered in thick clouds and the winds howled across the frozen tundra. As she moved deeper into the snowdrifts, she felt something wrong. A presence, something watching her from the shadows of the ice. Her breath came in quick, visible bursts, her heartbeat pounding in her chest. And then she saw them. Figures. Shadows moving quickly between the darkened trees. At first, they seemed to blend in with the ice and snow, barely perceptible. But as they came closer, the shapes became more distinct. tall, hunched figures with glowing eyes, moving in and out of sight, always just on the edge of her vision. Their bodies were strange, twisted, not quite human, but not entirely animal either. They were something else. They were the Dogsmen. "Jacob," she shouted, stumbling back toward the base, her heart pounding in her chest. "We're not alone. They're out there. They're watching us." The others rushed to the windows, peering out into the storm, but saw nothing, only the wind and snow. But the feeling of being watched lingered, thick in the air, oppressive. That night, the team couldn't sleep. Every few hours, the howls would pierce the silence, drawing nearer. The walls of the base groaned under the weight of the cold, but it wasn't just the weather that made them uneasy. It was the feeling that something was coming, something ancient, something waiting for them to make a mistake. By the third night, the Dogsmen had made themselves known. They began to circle the base, their presence impossible to ignore. In the dead of night, the team could hear scratching at the walls, faint whispers in the wind, as though the very ice beneath their feet was alive with movement. No one could sleep. Everyone was on edge. "What do they want from us?" Sarah, a biologist on the team, asked, her voice trembling. "Why are they here?" Dr. Hurst could feel the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. The skull, the discovery. It was all too connected. She had been studying ancient species for years, but this was different. This was something far older than they had imagined. The Dogsmen were no mere predators. They were remnants of an ancient species, something that had once ruled these lands before the ice came and buried them. They had been awakened by the disturbance in their home, the ancient skull, brought back to the base. The realization hit her like a cold wave. They were reclaiming their land. The next day, the team made the decision to venture into the wilderness to investigate further. They knew the dangers, but they were driven by a need to understand. They had uncovered something far greater than they had anticipated, and they had to know what it all meant. But as they ventured deeper into the icy expanse, the Dogsmen were always there, just out of sight, moving silently in the shadows. Their eyes burned through the darkness, following every step the researchers took. As the days passed, the team began to deteriorate mentally. The isolation, the constant howling, the terror that something was lurking just beyond their vision. They couldn't take it anymore. They began to argue, to turn on each other. Jacob, usually the most logical of the group, began to show signs of delirium, muttering about the curse of the ice and the ancient pack that would never leave. It was Sarah who snapped first. She wandered off into the wilderness, convinced that the Dogsmen had already claimed her, that she was already one of them. The team found her the next day, standing in the snow, her eyes wild, her body covered in frost. She didn't recognize them. She spoke only in broken phrases, rambling about the return of the pack and how they would claim the earth again. "We shouldn't have disturbed them," she whispered, her voice cracked and hollow. "They are ancient. They never left." The Dogsmen began to close in. The snowstorm outside raged with fury, but the team's worst fears were realized when they heard the unmistakable sound of claws on ice. The creatures were inside the base. Dr. Hurst and Jacob bolted to the lab, the only place with a locked door that might hold them off for a while. But as they turned to face the door, they heard the scratching, the growls, the whispers growing louder and louder, almost as if the ice was alive with their presence. "They want the skull back," Jacob said, his eyes wide with terror. "They want to reclaim their land." And in that moment, as the wind howled and the creatures outside clawed at the walls, Dr. Hurst realized the terrifying truth. They were not merely predators. They were guardians. And the skull, this relic of a species lost to time, was the key to their return. The Dogsmen were not just hunting for food. They were hunting for a return to their ancient domain. And the researchers, well, they were nothing more than intruders in a world that had long since turned to ice. With the base slowly being overtaken, Dr. Hurst knew there was no escaping. The Dogsmen would claim this land again, as they had so long ago, and the ancient cycle would begin anew. As the shadows crept closer, she could hear the whispering wind, the low growls of the dogsmen in the distance. They had returned. The ice was no longer a prison, it was a tomb. Story number 5. The world had ended long ago. At least that's what most people believed. Civilization had crumbled, leaving nothing behind but ruins and desolation. Cities lay in ruins, nature had reclaimed much of the land, and the remnants of human history were slowly being eaten by the earth. But for those who remained, survival was all that mattered. Sam was one of the last survivors, wandering through the wasteland in search of shelter, food, and perhaps some shred of hope. For years he had roamed the ravaged world, always moving, always avoiding the creatures that now ruled the land. The dogsmen. He had heard the stories. They were the twisted remnants of humanity, men who had been turned into something far worse, part human, part wolf, predators with a savage hunger. There were whispers that a strange force, some ancient evil, had transformed them, a curse or a power that had driven them mad, and now they hunted the last remnants of humankind. Sam had learned to be careful. He moved silently, stayed out of sight, and never lingered too long in any place. But today, as he moved through a barren stretch of coastline, he saw something that made him pause. A lighthouse, its silhouette standing tall against the orange glow of the dying sun. It had been years since he'd seen anything like it, a beacon of light amidst the chaos. It wasn't much, but it was a sign of hope. Maybe he wasn't the last one after all. With renewed determination, Sam made his way toward the lighthouse, his heart pounding with the thought of finding other survivors. The closer he got, the more he could see that the place was ancient, weathered by time and neglect. Yet, despite the ruin, the lighthouse still flickered with a faint, eerie light, almost as if it had been keeping watch over the dead world for years. When he arrived at the base, he found the door slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for him. Cautiously, he stepped inside. The interior was dark, save for the flickering light at the top. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he made his way up the narrow spiral staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the top, he found a small group of survivors huddled together in the glow of the light. Their eyes were hollow, their faces gaunt, but they were alive, but not quite human anymore. The leader, a grizzled man with a scarred face, looked up when Sam entered. He didn't seem surprised to see him. "You found the last light," the man said hoarsely, his voice carrying a deep sorrow. "But don't get too comfortable. You won't last long." Sam glanced around the room, taking in the strange atmosphere. There were claw marks scratched into the walls, deep gouges that looked like something had tried to break in. Bloodstains dotted the floor in thin, red lines. The survivors seemed unfazed by the carnage, as though they had grown used to it. Who did this?" Sam asked, his voice trembling with fear. The man's eyes hardened, and he gestured toward the window. Outside, the horizon was darkening, the sun fading beneath the ruins of the world. But there, in the distance, Sam saw something. Shapes moving in the shadows, figures that seemed to slink and shift, always just out of sight. His blood ran cold as he realized what they were. "The dogsmen," the man said grimly. "They've been hunting us for years." Sam stepped closer, his pulse quickening. "Hunting you? What do you mean?" The survivor sighed, his hand trembling as he ran it through his disheveled hair. "We've been trying to hold them off for as long as we can. The lighthouse, it's the only thing keeping them at bay. But it's not just the light. There's something else about this place. Something dark. It's the light that draws them in, and the creature that controls them. It feeds off the light. It has an insidious connection to this place, to the beacon, and it's been using the dogsmen to keep us trapped here." A chill ran through Sam. A creature? What kind of creature? The man looked at him, his eyes full of dread. "We don't know exactly. We thought it was a god at first, something that controls the dogsmen, something that makes them hunt. But now, we think it's something worse. It's tied to the light. If we don't keep the beacon running, if the light ever goes out, the dogsman will come for us all." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sam could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. This place, this lighthouse, it wasn't just a refuge. It was a prison, and the light was the only thing keeping the horrors at bay. That night, as the wind howled outside and the darkness swallowed the world, the dogsmen came. They appeared first as shadows, figures that moved just outside the range of the light, their glowing eyes reflecting the flickering beacon. Sam could hear their howls in the distance, deep and haunting, echoing through the night like a chorus of the damned. The survivors huddled together, their eyes wide with fear, as they waited. Sam stood at the window, watching the movement in the distance. The dogsmen were closing in, but they never ventured too close. It was as if they knew the light would burn them, that it held them back. But there was something else. Something that gnawed at Sam's mind. The way the creatures seemed to wait, circling the lighthouse like wolves closing in on their prey. They weren't just waiting for the survivors to weaken, they were waiting for something more. As the hours passed, the light flickered and dimmed. The beam of the lighthouse struggled against the darkness, wavering as if it were alive, and suddenly, the truth became clear to Sam. It wasn't just the dogsmen who were drawn to the light, it was the creature that controlled them, a force that thrived on the light's energy, feeding off it, using it as a beacon to summon its pack. In a sudden rush of understanding, Sam realized the lighthouse wasn't just a place of safety. It was the creature's hunting ground, its sanctuary. The survivors trapped inside were simply the bait, kept alive to feed the creature's insatiable hunger. He turned to the leader, his voice trembling with the weight of realization. "What happens when the light goes out? What will they do to us?" The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the window, where the dogsmen were now closer than they had ever been before. "We've tried to fix it," he said quietly. "But every time we think we've repaired it, the light flickers again. It's as though the creature inside the lighthouse is sabotaging us, making sure the light never stays bright for long." And then, the unthinkable happened. The light went out. A scream rang out from the back of the room, a scream of terror that echoed through the cold stone walls. Sam turned toward the door and saw the shadowy figures of the dogsmen, their glowing eyes now visible in the pitch-black darkness. The howls had grown louder, closer, and now they were at the door. "They're here," the man whispered, his voice breaking. The lighthouse trembled, as if it were alive, responding to the presence of the creatures outside. Sam felt the air grow thick with dread. The light, gone, had freed the dogsmen, and now they would be slaughtered. In the chaos that followed, the survivors fought, firing weapons at the creatures, but their attacks were futile. The dogsmen were too fast, too strong. The sound of snapping bones and tearing flesh filled the air, mingling with the howls of the pack. Sam was frozen, unable to move, until the leader grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the staircase. "The light, it's our only hope," the man gasped. "We have to turn it back on." But as Sam followed him toward the control room, he realized something horrific. The creature that controlled the dogsmen wasn't just a monster, it was a part of the lighthouse. And if they could not restore the light, if they failed, they would never escape. As the dogsmen closed in, Sam made his choice. He couldn't let the light flicker again. The world had already fallen into darkness. He had to make sure it stayed the last light, no matter the cost. And in that moment, Sam understood. There was no escape from the creature. It had claimed the lighthouse long before the world had ended, and it would never let go. The last light had burned out, and the pack had come to claim it. Story number 6. The city had worn them down, its noise, its chaos, its unrelenting pace. For years, the Baxter family had dreamed of escaping it all, of finding a place where they could breathe freely, where they could rebuild the bond they had lost in the whirlwind of urban life. So when Sarah Baxter found the remote lakeside cabin for rent, miles away from the nearest neighbor, it seemed like the perfect solution. A chance to start fresh, to find peace, and to rediscover the beauty of quiet, slow days. They arrived in early autumn, the air crisp and cool, the trees turning shades of orange and gold. The cabin was nestled in a secluded cove on the edge of a vast, serene lake. From the outside, it was picturesque, almost idyllic, an old wooden structure that looked as though it had been untouched by time. The lake stretched out before them, its waters still, reflecting the deepening sky as the sun began to set. Sarah felt a sigh of relief escape her lips as she stood on the porch, inhaling the fresh mountain air. "This is perfect," she whispered, looking at her husband, Jason, who was already unloading the car. Their two children, Noah and Emily, raced toward the dock, excited to explore the quiet waters. They had no idea what awaited them in the lake's depths. That first night, everything seemed calm. They ate dinner, laughing and talking about their hopes for the coming weeks. As the darkness settled, they lit a fire in the stone hearth and curled up on the couch. Outside, the world was quiet. The only sounds, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the soft murmur of water lapping against the shore. But then, as the clock struck midnight, something stirred on the lake. At first, Sarah thought it was the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate, almost like something large moving through the water, a deep throbbing pulse that seemed to echo from the depths. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, reverberating against the walls of the cabin. Sarah's heart began to race. She glanced at Jason, who had already noticed it too. The children were asleep, their quiet breathing filling the room, unaware of the sounds creeping closer. The air grew thick with tension. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Jason nodded, his brow furrowed. "It sounds like something swimming out there." "Could be a big fish, right?" Sarah suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. Jason didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting nervously toward the darkened window that overlooked the lake. Something felt off. A chill ran down his spine, an instinctual sense that this wasn't a natural sound. There was something wrong out there, something far bigger than a fish. The low, rhythmic sound continued, growing louder and more distinct, until it was impossible to ignore. Suddenly, there was a massive splash, followed by a deafening thud, like something huge crashing into the water. Jason jumped to his feet, his eyes wide. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and rushed outside, Sarah close behind. The lake was a mirror in the moonlight, its surface still and calm, as though nothing had disturbed it. But the air around them felt charged with an unnatural energy. The sound had stopped, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence before something terrifying. Then, from the depths of the lake, something broke the surface. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a person. It was something monstrous. A massive, hulking figure rose from the water, dripping with blackness, its silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. Its body was a twisted, grotesque blend of man and animal, hair matted and wet, claws sharp and glinting, eyes glowing with an eerie yellow light that seemed to pierce the darkness. Sarah gasped, her breath catching in her throat, her body frozen in place. The creature, half human, half wolf, stood on two legs towering over them, its muscles rippling beneath its wet fur. Its mouth was wide, filled with teeth like daggers, dripping with saliva. And its eyes, those glowing predatory eyes, fixed on them, as if the creature had been waiting for them, watching them since they had arrived. For a moment, neither Sarah nor Jason could move. They could only stare, the terror sinking deep into their bones. Then the creature lunged forward, its massive form bounding from the water and onto the shore with terrifying speed. Jason pushed Sarah back, shouting at her to run. The creature snarled, a guttural sound that rattled the very air. Its claws scraped against the earth as it turned to follow them. "Get inside! Go!" Jason yelled as he pulled his family toward the cabin. They scrambled inside, slamming the door behind them, but the creature wasn't far behind. Its claws scraped against the wood, the sound deafening, as if the creature were trying to tear the door off its hinges. The windows rattled, and the air grew thick with the scent of wet fur and death. Noah and Emily awoke, terrified, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What's happening, Mom?" "Dad!" Emily cried, clutching her brother's arm. Sarah and Jason didn't have time to answer. They grabbed their children, pulling them into the center of the room. The creature outside was relentless, scratching and clawing at the door, its snarls growing louder with each passing second. Every now and then, a low growl would shake the floor, like the earth itself was trembling in fear. "We need to do something," Jason shouted, panic rising in his chest. "We can't just stay here." Sarah's mind raced. The lake, the creature. It wasn't just a random attack. It was as though the beast had been drawn to them, as though it had been waiting for them. But why? "We need to figure out what's going on with the lake," Sarah said, her voice frantic but determined. "There's something about this place, Jason. This isn't just an animal attack, it's connected to the lake." Suddenly they heard a new sound, a series of distant, chilling howls. It wasn't just the creature at their door. There were others lurking beneath the surface, waiting. The family realized then that the creature wasn't alone. It had brought its pack with it. The next few hours were a blur of desperation. Jason and Sarah barricaded the windows, bolted the doors, and did everything they could to keep the creatures out. But it wasn't enough. The sounds from the lake grew closer, as if the creatures were preparing for a final assault. Each howl made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end. "We have to leave," Jason said, his voice hoarse. "We can't fight them, not here." But Sarah shook her head. "We can't. We need to understand what's happening. If we leave now, they'll keep coming back. We have to stop them." And so, as the night stretched on, Sarah and Jason made a decision. They would venture into the lake, to the place where the creature had emerged, to uncover the truth about what lay beneath the surface. With no other choice, they ventured out just before dawn, armed with little more than their courage and a few tools. The lake was still, too still, as if the waters themselves were holding their breath. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay. They waded into the water, the cold biting at their skin, and followed the dark, rippling trail that led to the heart of the lake. And then they found it. At the bottom of the lake, hidden beneath the murky depths, was an ancient, submerged altar. It was covered in strange symbols worn by time but still visible. As Sarah touched it, the water seemed to pulse, as though it had been waiting for this moment. In the distance, the howls of the pack grew louder, closer, as if the creatures were drawing near, sensing the awakening. The creature that had attacked them wasn't just a mindless predator. It was a guardian, a protector of the lake, and it had been guarding something older, something more sinister. The altar was a relic, a seal, keeping something far darker from rising. Until now. And now it was too late. The creatures were here, and they had come to reclaim the lake. The family's only hope was to destroy the altar before the ancient evil fully awakened. But as Sarah and Jason made their final move, they realized the truth. They weren't the hunters anymore. They had become the prey. The silent lake had whispered its secrets, and now its creatures were coming for them all. Story number 7. There was a thrill that came with the hunt. It wasn't just about the kill. It was the challenge, the danger, the raw adrenaline of stalking something that could fight back. For Matt Carter and his team of seasoned hunters, this was their element. The deep, untamed wilderness of the Pacific Northwest was a paradise for men like them. It was a place where legends were born, where the stories of elusive creatures, some real, others imagined, lived in every shadow, every rustling leaf. This was supposed to be just another hunt. A legendary bear, known as the silverback, had been sighted in the region for years, a creature of enormous size and power that had become the stuff of campfire stories. No one had ever brought it down, and Matt, with his reputation as one of the best in the business, was determined to be the one to claim it. He gathered his crew, a seasoned mix of men, all hand-picked for their skills and experience. There was Rick, the sharp-eyed tracker, Jason, the muscle, and Frank, a seasoned sniper with nerves of steel. Together they ventured into the heart of the dense, fog-covered forest, preparing for the hunt of a lifetime. The first days were quiet. The forest was unnervingly still, as if the animals knew something was coming. No bird calls, no rustling of small creatures, just the deep silence that pressed against them like a thick fog. But Matt didn't let it faze him. They were deep in bear territory, and the silence could only mean one thing: the silverback was nearby. By the third day, they had found signs, scratched trees, broken branches, and enormous footprints that could only belong to the legendary bear. It was real, and it was close. They set up camp, working in shifts as they planned their next move. But as night fell, a strange unease settled over them. Matt, ever the seasoned hunter, knew something was off. There was a feeling in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The forest felt too quiet, too watchful. The first incident came without warning. Rick, who had been on lookout, came rushing back to camp, his face pale with fear. "It's watching us," he muttered, almost incoherently. Something's out there. Watching." Jason laughed, brushing it off. "It's just the bear. We've been on edge for too long." But Rick wasn't convinced. "No, this isn't the bear. It's something else. I heard it moving, just outside the camp, too fast, too quiet." Matt's eyes narrowed. He hadn't heard anything, but something about Rick's tone made him uneasy. The forest had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially in the dead of night. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Rick was right. There was something in the trees, something hunting them. They decided to stay on high alert. The next morning, they ventured deeper into the woods, following the fresh signs of the silverback. But as they moved farther into the forest, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made their hearts race. At times, they thought they saw movement in the corners of their eyes. But when they turned, there was nothing there. By the fifth day, the tension was unbearable. The team had lost track of their quarry, and the feeling of being followed had only intensified. The worst part, they were no longer sure whether they were chasing the bear or being stalked by something else, something much more dangerous. It was then that they saw it. At first, it was just a glimpse, movement in the distance, just beyond the trees. But when Matt focused, he realized what it was. A figure, large, hulking, and hunched, more like a man than a bear, yet not quite human either. It was covered in matted fur, its eyes glowing yellow in the dim forest light. It stood still for a moment, watching them, before it melted back into the shadows. Matt's breath caught in his chest. He knew what he had seen, but he couldn't believe it. A dogsman. The creature was like nothing they had ever encountered. Part wolf, part man. A twisted hybrid that stalked the woods of the Pacific Northwest like an ancient predator, a legend among the locals. It wasn't just one, they were being surrounded. The pack moved with eerie silence, always staying just out of sight, always just out of reach. No matter how fast they moved, the hunters felt the weight of the pack's gaze upon them. Every sound felt like a warning, every movement like a trap. And it was clear now. They weren't the hunters. They were the hunted. That night, as they huddled around a small campfire, the first attack came. It was sudden, a blur of motion, a massive form charging out of the darkness. It was one of the dogsmen, but it was fast, too fast for any human to react in time. The creature leapt onto Jason, knocking him to the ground with terrifying force. Jason screamed, reaching for his rifle, but the dogsman's claws were already sinking into his flesh, tearing into him with brutal precision. The sound of bones breaking echoed in the night, followed by a sickening howl as the creature dragged Jason's body into the woods. The others were too stunned to move, but they knew they had to act fast. They grabbed their rifles, firing into the darkness. But the dogsmen were faster than any bear, more cunning than any predator. The pack had learned to hunt in the shadows, to strike with deadly precision. For every shot they fired, two more dogsmen appeared, stalking them from the edges of the camp. And that was when the twist came. Matt and Rick, barely holding their ground, were cornered by a massive figure, an alpha among the pack, far larger than the others, its eyes burning with an unnatural intelligence. It stepped into the firelight, its twisted grin revealing rows of sharp, serrated teeth. But it wasn't the creature that terrified them most. It was the realization that had just dawned on them. The dogsmen weren't hunting them for sport. They weren't even hunting them for food. They were using them as bait. As the alpha circled them, Matt's heart sank. He had been played from the beginning. The dogsmen had been watching them, tracking their every move, using their presence to draw out something much worse from the depths of the forest. They were not the true prey. The sound of something massive moving through the trees sent a wave of dread through them. Something larger, something darker. And then they saw it. A massive creature, far bigger than any bear, lumbered into view. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its eyes glowed with a feral rage. But it wasn't just a bear. It was something older, something far worse. A creature from a time long past, woken by the scent of blood, hungry for the hunt. The dogsmen weren't just protecting it, they were feeding it. The true predator, the ancient creature that had lived in the woods long before mankind came, had been awakened by the dogsmen's manipulation. The pack had used the hunters to lure this massive, unstoppable force out of the darkness. Matt realized too late. They had never been hunting the silverback. They had been brought here to be consumed by something much more ancient, more terrifying than any legend could ever explain. As the creature lumbered closer, its massive claws scraping the forest floor, Matt and Rick made their final desperate attempt to survive. But there was no escaping the true terror of the forest. The dogsmen watched from the shadows as the ancient creature rose, and the last hunters of the Pacific Northwest became the final sacrifice in a twisted game of survival. The hunted had become the prey of something far worse, and the forest would claim them all. Story number 8. It was supposed to be an easy job, a fresh start in a quiet, rural town far from the bustling city. For Noah, the promise of hard work and a steady paycheck on a secluded farm was an opportunity he couldn't resist. The farmer, an elderly man named Mr. Finch, had a reputation for keeping to himself, and the farm he owned was nestled deep in the hills, far from the nearest neighbor. Noah didn't mind. In fact, he liked the isolation. It was a perfect way to escape his troubled past and start over. When Noah first arrived, the place seemed idyllic, a weathered farmhouse surrounded by wide fields of crops, tall, waving grasses, and a distant barn that looked like it had been there for generations. But from the first moment he stepped onto the farm, Mr. Finch made one thing abundantly clear: don't go near the woods. The warning was cryptic, delivered with a serious tone and a glance that seemed to carry an unspoken weight. But Mr. Finch was an old man, and Noah assumed it was just one of those local superstitions, the sort of advice farmers give to city folk with wild imaginations. At first, Noah followed the rules. He worked the fields during the day, fixed fences, and took care of the animals. But as the days passed, the woods, dark and brooding just beyond the edge of the farm, became an obsession. He often found himself staring at the tree line, wondering what secrets it held. There was something about it that called to him, an inexplicable pull that he couldn't ignore. On the 7th night, when the full moon hung high in the sky, Noah finally gave in to the temptation. He told himself he would just take a quick look, a small adventure. He'd venture into the woods for a little while, then return before Mr. Finch even noticed. The woods were quiet after all. How dangerous could they really be? He grabbed a flashlight, stepped out into the cool night, and made his way toward the trees. As he entered the forest, the dense canopy above blocked out most of the moonlight, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with him. The air was thick, damp with moisture, and the scent of pine and decaying leaves clung to the air. He walked deeper, drawn by the dark whispers of the trees, his heart pounding in his chest with a strange excitement. The deeper he ventured, the more the woods seemed to change. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their bark blackened as though scorched by fire. Strange carvings, half hidden by the undergrowth, marked the trunks of the oldest trees, symbols he couldn't decipher but that filled him with an uneasy sense of foreboding. It was as though the forest itself was watching him, waiting. He continued on, following an old, barely visible trail that wound through the forest like a forgotten memory. His flashlight flickered as he moved, casting long, wavering beams of light across the shadows. It wasn't long before he came upon something that stopped him dead in his tracks. At the center of a small clearing stood a stone monument, a circle of ancient stones, weathered and moss-covered. In the middle of the circle was a strange, cracked altar, stained with something dark and dried. Noah couldn't tell what it was, but the smell was overpowering, sickly, metallic, and faintly rancid. As he stepped closer, his foot caught on something hidden beneath the dirt. He knelt down, brushing aside the leaves and soil, and uncovered a weathered, bone-like object, a skull, half buried and discolored by age. It was canine, large and imposing, with sharp, elongated teeth that gleamed in the light. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. This was no ordinary animal skull. It was far too large, far too unnatural. And then he heard it. A low growl, deep and guttural, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as a chill swept through him. Noah's eyes darted around the clearing, his pulse racing. He wasn't alone. He backed away slowly, but before he could turn to leave, the shadows seemed to shift around him. A figure emerged from the trees. A silhouette, tall and impossibly thin, its form blending seamlessly with the darkness. Noah froze, his blood running cold. The creature stepped into the clearing, its eyes gleaming like amber lanterns in the night. Its body was a twisted blend of man and wolf, fur matted with age, claws that scraped against the ground as it moved. It was one of them, one of the dogsmen, and it was staring directly at him. Noah wanted to run, to flee back to the farm, but his feet refused to move. He could feel its presence growing stronger, its hunger in the air, thick and palpable. The creature didn't lunge at him. Instead, it circled him slowly, its gaze never leaving his face. And then, to his horror, it spoke. "You are the one." Noah's breath caught in his throat. The voice was guttural, raw, but it carried a weight, a command, as if the creature knew something he did not. It circled again, its steps heavy and deliberate. "You have disturbed what was meant to stay buried," the creature continued, its voice filled with an ancient, haunting resonance. "The land remembers. The land calls." A surge of panic flooded through Noah. He had no idea what the creature meant, but something deep inside him, some primal instinct, told him to run. As he turned, his flashlight flickered out, and the world around him fell into total darkness. He stumbled through the forest, branches slashing at his skin, the growl of the dogsman growing louder and closer behind him. When he finally burst out of the woods and into the open fields of the farm, he was gasping for air, drenched in sweat and covered in scratches. The moonlit sky above him seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, as if the forest itself had watched him flee. But when he turned to look back, there was nothing in the trees. The forest was still. The next morning, Mr. Finch was waiting for him at the farmhouse, as if he had been expecting him. His face was grim, his eyes hard. "You went into the woods," he said, his voice low and filled with something Noah had never heard before. "Fear. Didn't I tell you not to?" Noah nodded mutely, his heart still racing. He couldn't shake the image of the creature's glowing eyes, the strange voice echoing in his mind. But it wasn't just the dogsman that haunted him now. It was what the creature had said. "The land remembers. The land calls." Mr. Finch sighed, as though he had been waiting for this moment. "The land you stand on was never meant to be settled, boy. The woods have been here long before the farm, and the creatures in them, they were once its guardians." Noah frowned, confused. "Guardians? What do you mean?" "They were not just animals," Mr. Finch explained, his eyes distant, as if he was seeing something from long ago. "They were protectors. The dogsman. Long ago, the land was a sacred place, a burial ground for those who were wronged. But something happened. The creatures of the forest, the guardians, they became twisted. They became part of the land they once protected." Noah's stomach twisted as he remembered the bone-like skull and the altar in the woods. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a dark secret, a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. There's a reason the land calls," Mr. Finch continued, his voice heavy with regret. "The dogsmen, they rise when the time is right. They rise when the earth demands it. And you, boy, you are the key." "The key?" Noah echoed, horrified. "You have awakened something," Mr. Finch said, his voice hoarse, as if the words hurt to say. "The dogsmen are drawn to you, the burial ground beneath this farm, beneath your feet. It is the source, and now that you've crossed into their realm, they won't let you leave." Noah's eyes widened with realization. The farm, the land, the woods, it had all been a trap. And now, the dogsmen would claim what they believed was theirs, with Noah at the center of it all. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fields, and in the distance, from the trees, Noah could hear it, the low, haunting growl of the pack, closing in. The land had called, and now, the farmhand was part of their resurrection. The dogsmen were rising, and Noah would never escape their grasp. Story number 9. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the dense woods that surrounded the forgotten village. The air was thick with the scent of moss and rotting wood, as if the very earth had swallowed the memories of this place and kept them hidden for years. The village had been abandoned decades ago, a place lost to time, erased from all maps and records, except of course in the whispered rumors of locals who knew better than to speak of it. For a group of urban explorers, however, the mystery was too tantalizing to resist. They were driven by the thrill of discovery, the hope of finding something forgotten by history, something buried deep within the cracks of time. There was a legend surrounding the village, one that spoke of an ancient cult and strange rites, but to the explorers, it was all just another challenge. A chance to uncover something extraordinary, to see what others had been too afraid to investigate. There were 5 of them. Dylan, the leader, charismatic and obsessed with uncovering the mysteries of forgotten places. Sarah, the photographer, eager to document every detail. Mark, the skeptic, always questioning the supernatural stories but eager to prove they were just myths. Lila, the researcher who had spent months digging through old records and had found the faded traces of the village's history. And Alex, the quiet one, who had a fascination with the occult but rarely spoke about it. They arrived in the late afternoon, the weather already starting to cool as the sun dipped behind the trees. The village was nothing more than a collection of rotting wooden houses and stone foundations, scattered across an overgrown valley. Nature had reclaimed what had once been a thriving community. But as they ventured deeper into the village, they began to notice oddities, strange symbols etched into the walls of abandoned homes, crude totems made from bones and sticks, and remnants of what could only be described as ritualistic offerings scattered around the ruins. Lila was the first to bring it up. "These symbols, they're not random," she said, crouching beside one of the totems, a twisted figure made from animal bones and bound with weathered leather. "They resemble something I found in the old folklore. They speak of a god, something like a guardian, but it's strange, not like anything I've ever seen." Dylan leaned over her shoulder, his excitement growing. "A forgotten god? That's exactly what we're here for. Let's see if we can piece it all together." They split up, each of them combing the area for more clues. As they moved farther into the village, the air grew heavier, and a sense of unease settled over them. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. There was no wildlife, no birds, no insects, just the thick, unnatural stillness. It wasn't until dusk that things started to feel truly wrong. Mark found the first of them. He was inspecting what had once been a small church, its windows shattered and its door hanging off its hinges. Inside, he found a large, circular stone slab embedded in the center of the floor. At first, he thought it was just a large altar, but as he examined it more closely, he noticed strange, worn carvings running along its edges, symbols similar to those they had seen on the totems. As he reached out to touch it, he felt a coldness seep into his fingertips, as though the stone had been chilled by something far older than the village itself. He recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. "Guys, you need to see this." The others gathered around him, peering into the church, and saw the stone slab with the symbols etched into its surface. Lila's eyes widened as she traced the markings with her fingers. This is a depiction of something ancient. A guardian. Guardian of what? Sarah asked, her voice uneasy. A guardian of the land, Lila murmured, her expression clouded. A protector, but not like any god I've heard of. This was worshipped by the villagers, by the cult. But what if the villagers didn't just worship it? What if they became part of it? The air around them seemed to thicken as the realization began to settle in. This village wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten for a reason. They hadn't just left, they had been taken. As night fell, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped and an eerie fog rolled in from the woods, obscuring the village in a cold mist. The explorers gathered around a fire in one of the few standing buildings, their nerves beginning to fray. They joked, trying to laugh off the unease that was spreading among them, but it didn't help. Something was wrong. Then they heard it. A low growl, deep and guttural, echoing from the woods. It was far away at first, but then it came closer, the sound growing louder, more distinct. A voice, not quite human, howled from the shadows. It was not the sound of a wolf. It was something more, something otherworldly. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble as the growl echoed through the trees. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "It's just an animal," Mark said, but even he sounded less certain now. But it wasn't just one growl, it was a chorus, a pack, closing in, circling them. The wind picked up, and with it came the sound of heavy footsteps, the crunching of leaves, and the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving through the brush. Suddenly, from the trees emerged figures, dark shapes moving swiftly, almost blending into the night. At first, they appeared to be men, tall and imposing. Their forms almost human but twisted and unnatural, with elongated limbs and clawed hands. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, like embers burning in the dark. And their faces were not human. They were something other, grotesque masks of canine-like features, wolves with twisted, contorted expressions, lips pulled back in eternal snarls, eyes gleaming with hunger. Lila gasped, "Dogsmen." The creatures were not merely animals. They were something far worse. They were guardians of the land, protectors of the ancient god that had once been worshipped here. The villagers hadn't abandoned the place. They had been sacrificed to the entity, transformed into twisted protectors, bound to the god's will for eternity. And now the dogsmen had risen again to claim those who had dared to disturb the sacred ground. The explorers stumbled back, their hearts racing. They tried to run, but the creatures were too fast, too cunning. Every movement they made seemed to be mirrored by the dogsmen, who moved with terrifying precision, as if they were always one step ahead. The pack surrounded them, forcing them into the center of the village, the stone slab they had discovered earlier looming like a dark altar. In the distance they heard something else, a whispering voice, a low chant rising from the earth itself, carried on the wind. The voice was ancient, primal, and its words were incomprehensible, but its meaning was clear. The god was waking, rising from the depths of the earth, demanding tribute, and the explorers, trapped within the ruins of the village, were to be the next sacrifice. They had awoken the dogsmen, and now the dogsmen would claim them, one by one, as the village's curse reached out to take those who dared to disturb its sacred ground. As the first of the pack lunged at Sarah, the last scream she would ever utter was swallowed by the forest, swallowed by the forgotten gods, and by the pack that had watched over them all these years. The village was forgotten no longer. The curse of the dogsmen had returned. Story number 10. The road stretched out before him, empty and shrouded in thick, suffocating fog. Thomas had been on the move for hours, his worn boots kicking up the damp earth beneath him, the weight of his exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. He had been traveling for days, trying to make his way home after a long business trip that had left him feeling more lost than he had ever felt before. The world around him felt unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, just the eerie sound of his own footsteps echoing through the thick mist. It had been a mistake to take this shortcut. He had been following a trail of signs that seemed to lead him deeper into the woods, and then suddenly, there it was. The road, old and worn, its edges cracked and uneven, but it was a road, and he needed to get to the next town. His phone had no signal, and the air felt too thick, too oppressive to be anything but the kind of place that was meant to be forgotten. "Just keep going," he muttered to himself, his breath rising in visible puffs in the cold air. "Just get through it." But no matter how far he walked, the fog seemed to stretch endlessly, and the road never seemed to end. It was as if it had been deliberately crafted to trick him, to trap him. After what felt like hours of walking, Thomas realized he hadn't seen a single signpost, no streetlights, and the trees had begun to recede, just an endless road that led nowhere. That's when he first saw it. At the edge of his vision, there was a movement, a figure, tall and thin, shrouded in shadow, standing just outside the reach of the fog. It wasn't quite human, its shape twisted and unnatural. The creature was hunched low, its arms unnaturally long, its back arched in a way that sent an instinctual shiver of terror down his spine. It moved with an unsettling grace, its body shifting unnaturally, like it was crawling on all fours. Thomas froze in place, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to call out, to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. The figure didn't move toward him immediately. Instead, it seemed to observe him, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, like twin lanterns waiting to burn through the fog. The air felt heavy with its presence, like the very atmosphere had thickened in response to the creature's proximity. Thomas took a cautious step back, then another, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling, and then, without warning, the figure lunged. It moved with terrifying speed, the ground beneath it seeming to ripple as it closed the distance between them in mere seconds. Thomas's heart leapt into his throat, and without thinking, he turned and ran. He didn't look back. He couldn't. His boots pounded against the road, the fog swirling around him, thickening with every step. His breath was ragged in his chest, his legs burning with the effort, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. That thing was still out there following him, always just behind him. It wasn't long before he realized that something was wrong, strangely wrong. The road ahead of him hadn't changed. He should have reached the town by now, or at least seen something, anything familiar. But all he could see was the same stretch of road leading into the same endless fog. He looked behind him, the creature still following him, moving through the mist with unnatural ease, its glowing eyes locked onto him, its movements impossibly fluid. He forced himself to keep running, the pounding of his heart drowning out the sound of his footsteps. But when he glanced forward again, he saw it, something he hadn't expected. The road had looped back on itself. The same stretch of cracked earth, the same twisted trees, the same shrouded mist that had greeted him when he first started running. "No, no, no, no!" Thomas gasped, his voice trembling as panic seized him. He had turned a corner, crossed over a bridge, and yet here he was, back where he started. The same desolate stretch of road stretched out before him, the same oppressive fog hanging in the air like a suffocating blanket. And then, the growl. A low, rumbling sound that reverberated from the fog itself, sending tremors through his body. He wasn't alone. The creature was still behind him. He had tried to outrun it, but the road, this cursed endless road, would never let him escape. Thomas stumbled forward again, his mind scrambling for some kind of logic, some explanation. But there was none. Every time he turned a corner, the road twisted back in on itself. The fog thickened, and the creature, the dogsman, kept following. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he traveled, the road would always loop back to where he began. The fog seemed to whisper now, low murmurs that made no sense, as though the road itself was alive, an ancient thing, watching him. He was trapped in a never-ending cycle, bound by the will of the land. This is their road. You're a part of it now. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The figure stalking him was not simply a creature of the night, not a wild animal or a twisted shadow. It was something much worse. It was the Dogsmen, the guardians of this cursed road, an ancient force bound to this place. The road itself was cursed, and those who wandered upon it became part of its endless loop, forever hunted by the Dogsmen, forever trapped in the fog. Thomas's legs were giving out. His breath was shallow and desperate. He had nowhere left to run, nowhere left to go. The fog was closing in, and the Dogsmen were closing in too. Their eyes gleamed from the mist just beyond his reach, and their growls echoed through the air, vibrating the ground beneath him. He stumbled, falling to his knees, his hands pressed into the dirt as the weight of the road pressed down on him. He could feel the eyes of the Dogsmen watching him, the cold breath of their presence just behind him, reaching out for him. There was no escape. The road is endless. The Dogsmen will always find you. It was then that Thomas understood. He had been doomed the moment he set foot on this cursed road. This wasn't just a place, it was a prison, and now he was one of its prisoners. The shadowy figure lunged, its long claws scraping the air as it closed in. But this time, Thomas didn't try to run. There was no point anymore. The road had already claimed him. And as the Dogsmen surrounded him, their glowing eyes burning in the thick fog, Thomas realized with chilling clarity that the road was not just a path, it was a trap, a prison for those who dared to venture too far from the beaten path. The Dogsmen, the eternal guardians of this cursed road, would chase him forever. They would never stop. The fog swallowed him whole, and the road kept stretching on, endless and silent, for anyone else who would dare to wander too close. Story number 11. It was meant to be a simple night, a reunion of old friends gathered together around a campfire in the middle of the woods. The air was cool, and the sky above was a blanket of stars. The fire crackled and popped, sending tiny embers into the air. It had been years since they had all been together. High school was long behind them, and the years had carved their own separate paths, but tonight they were here, laughing, reminiscing, and letting go of the weight of their adult lives. There was something primal about the woods at night, the scent of pine, the cool bite of the air, the way the darkness felt alive. And like all reunions, it was filled with that strange energy, the need to recapture some of the reckless youth of their past. "So, what do we do now?" asked Nick, the group's unofficial leader, leaning back on the ground with his arms behind his head. His eyes were wide, his face illuminated by the glow of the fire. "Truth or dare?" Kelly said with a mischievous grin. "Classic." The group laughed, but there was a lightness in Kelly's voice that everyone knew meant she was serious. They had played the game 100 times when they were younger, back when the stakes were nothing but harmless secrets or silly challenges. But tonight felt different. There was an electric charge in the air, something that made the game seem more important. "Yeah, let's do it," Brian said, tossing a twig into the fire. And so it began. The night unfolded like it always did. Silly dares, embarrassing truths, the camaraderie that had formed the core of their friendship. The circle of friends tightened, and the flames flickered as laughter and dare after dare filled the air. But then it came, the dare that would change everything. "Nick," Kelly said, her voice suddenly cold, her eyes gleaming with something darker than before. "I dare you to go deeper into the woods. You know the rules, no backing out." Nick froze. His heart began to thump in his chest. He glanced around at his friends, all of them looking at him with a mix of curiosity and challenge, as if daring him to show them that he could still take on anything. But there was something about the woods tonight, something about the shadows that stretched further than they should that unsettled him. The firelight flickered, casting long, twisting shadows, and for a moment, Nick wasn't sure if the trees in the distance were moving. He shook it off. It was just nerves. Just the game. "Fine," Nick said, his voice steady. "I'll do it." Without another word, he stood up and began walking into the woods, deeper and deeper, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the dark. The others sat in silence, the weight of the dare heavy in the air. Minutes passed, then an hour. The laughter stopped. The fire crackled less brightly. "I don't like this," Kelly whispered, the playful edge gone from her voice. "I'm sure he's fine," Brian replied, though his voice lacked conviction. But as the minutes stretched on, an unease settled over them. The woods were eerily silent, not a single sound of wildlife or wind. They were waiting, and yet nothing stirred. Finally, when it felt like they could no longer sit idly, a distant howl echoed from deep in the woods. A long, haunting cry, like the wind itself was mourning something lost. "Is that Nick?" Kelly asked, her voice shaky. Her eyes flicked toward the darkness. "That didn't sound like him." "I'll go find him," Brian volunteered, already rising to his feet. But before he could take a step, a figure appeared in the darkness, a tall, shadowy shape moving with unnatural speed. It was Nick, but it wasn't. His form was hunched, his skin a pale, sickly gray under the moonlight. His back arched unnaturally, as if his bones had been twisted. His eyes, glowing faintly, looked out from his face. But they weren't Nick's eyes. There was something else behind them, something older and more terrible. His mouth hung open in a twisted snarl, revealing sharp, pointed teeth that looked too large for a human jaw. The group froze. "Nick!" Kelly whispered, but the figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a step toward them, its limbs jerking in a way that made it clear it wasn't human. The others could hear the low growl that rumbled from its chest, a sound that vibrated through their very bones. It was the sound of something that didn't belong here. "Run!" Brian hissed, but no one moved. The creature, Nick, had already started advancing, its distorted limbs pushing it closer. Then, from behind the figure, the others emerged, dozens of them. Figures, humanoid, twisted, hunched over, with glowing eyes, moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. They were like shadows, gliding effortlessly through the fog that had begun to roll in around the campfire. They were dogsmen. Kelly gasped, stumbling back, her breath catching in her throat. "What the hell are they?" she whispered. They were the spirits of those who had once played the game of truth or dare and failed to escape. Their twisted forms were the price for daring to challenge the game. The figures stepped closer, circling the group. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something ancient and evil. The friends realized that they weren't simply dealing with wild creatures. She was in their territory now. The others began to scatter, running, but the dogsmen were faster, their movements unnatural, covering the distance between them with terrifying speed. Every turn, every move, led them back into the circle. They couldn't outrun them. And when the last friend, Brian, was caught, he was dragged into the darkness, his screams swallowed by the forest. Now, Kelly and the others were faced with the brutal truth. There was no escaping. The dogsmen, the eternal guardians of the game, would not let them leave. The game had just begun, and they were the next players. Kelly turned and looked around, her heart racing. "We have to survive the game," she whispered. "We have to play their rules or we'll never leave. They'll take us all, forever." But the dogsmen were already closing in, and with every step they took, the game grew more deadly. The friends, now no more than prey, would either join the pack or become part of the twisted game forever. There was no escaping their fate. In the dark of the woods, the game had begun again, and losing meant becoming part of pack. Story number 12. The town of Hollow Creek had always been small, isolated, and steeped in a kind of quiet, unassuming charm that bordered on the eerie. Nestled in the valley of a forgotten mountain range, it was a town that had little interest in the outside world. People lived simple lives here, their days marked by the steady rhythm of farming, church services, and the occasional festival that brightened the long, cold winters. Yet there was a dark thread running through its history, woven so tightly into the fabric of the town's past that no one dared speak of it, except in whispers. Lily Simmons had always felt it. The pull, the sense that something about Hollow Creek had always been a little off. She didn't know when it started, but She had been having strange dreams for as long as she could remember. Dreams of ancient forests, of a pack of wolves, or were they something more? With human-like faces, their eyes glowing with an unholy fire. They would chase her through the woods, always just behind her, never catching her, yet always so close. But the most unsettling part of the dreams was the deep, undeniable connection she felt to them, like they were her ancestors. Grandma always said dreams like that run in the family, her mother would say, shaking her head when Lily brought it up. Your grandmother had them too. It's nothing but fancy, don't worry about it. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something she needed to understand. When she first heard about the eclipse, she didn't think much of it. Eclipses were common enough, and people in town were excited about the rare event, a celestial display that would turn the day into a brief, strange twilight. But when Lily began to research the event in the old town archives, her unease grew. The deeper she dug, the more disturbing the findings became. The town of Hollow Creek, according to old journals and faded newspaper clippings, had been settled centuries ago by a secret society, a cult-like group of people who believed in the power of an ancient bloodline tied to the Dogsman, creatures half human, half wolf, that roamed the forests of the town. The society's name was lost to history, but their ritual remained. Every time a rare eclipse passed over the town, the society would perform a sacrificial rite, a ritual meant to ensure the survival of the bloodline. They would sacrifice one of their own, chosen by a mysterious process that was tied to a deep ancestral bond. As the eclipse grew near, Lily's investigation uncovered a chilling truth. The creatures were not simply myth or imagination. They were real, and the society had never stopped their dark practices, passing the ritual down through generations. Her bloodline, it seemed, was directly tied to the Dogsman. Lily shuddered as she read the last of the journal entries, the handwriting growing more erratic and frenzied as the years passed. The final entry was clear. The bloodline must be kept pure. Every eclipse, someone must be chosen. And as Lily read, she felt the weight of the town's past pressing on her chest. A quiet panic rose as she realized what the ritual meant. She was the one who had been chosen. She was the sacrifice. She spent the next few days in a fog, wrestling with the impossible truth. Her bloodline had always been connected to the Dogsman, those twisted, half-human, half-wolf creatures that haunted her dreams. And now, with the eclipse approaching, the time for the ritual was drawing near. Lily tried to speak to the town's elders, but each time she approached them, they dismissed her with veiled indifference. They were hiding something. They knew more than they were letting on, and the more she asked, the more she felt the weight of their cold stares, as if they were watching her, waiting for her to figure it out. Desperation led her to a town elder, Old Man Harris, who had lived in Hollow Creek longer than anyone could remember. He was a hermit, living on the edge of the forest, and he was one of the few who still remembered the old stories. When Lily finally found him, he didn't greet her warmly. In fact, he seemed terrified to see her. "You shouldn't be here, girl," he rasped, his old voice trembling. "You have no idea what you're digging into. You don't know what's out there." Lily, determined to understand, demanded the truth. She needed to know what her connection to the Dogsman was, and why she had been chosen for the ritual. "The bloodline," Old Man Harris whispered, his eyes darting nervously around them. "It's not just a family connection. It's something deeper, older. The Dogsman, they are not just creatures, they are ancestors, born of human and animal. Every eclipse, a descendant of the original settlers must be sacrificed to keep them alive, to keep the bloodline pure." Lily's heart raced. But why me? Why now? Harris swallowed hard, his face pale. "You're the last of the line, Lily. The last one who can keep the curse from breaking. You've had the dreams, haven't you? The Dogsman, calling to you, waiting for you. They are tied to you, girl. Tied to your blood. The ritual, it will be completed with your death. Your soul will merge with them, and you will join the pack, leading them as the alpha of the next generation." Lily backed away, her mind spinning. She had never felt more alone in her entire life. The pack she had been dreaming of, those terrifying half-human creatures, were a part of her. Her family's legacy was one of horror, of blood and sacrifice. She wasn't just a victim of the ritual. She was a part of it. The eclipse was only days away. That night, Lily ventured into the woods, determined to find a way to break the cycle before it was too late. The trees loomed over her like silent sentinels, the air thick with a strange energy. Her footsteps were the only sound in the stillness, until a low growl echoed through the forest, sending a chill down her spine. The dogsmen were near. Her heart pounded in her chest as the growl turned into a full guttural snarl. Shadows moved around her, and Lily's breath caught in her throat. She could feel them, the pack, closing in. There was no escaping the truth now. The ritual was happening. They were coming for her. But as the creatures emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing with a primal hunger, Lily did not run. She stood her ground. She understood now what had to be done. With a deep breath, she raised her voice to the night. I reject the ritual. I reject the bloodline. I will not be your sacrifice. The dogsmen paused, their glowing eyes fixed on her, unreadable. For a moment, time seemed to stop. And then in a flash of movement, one of them, the largest, the alpha, stepped forward, its monstrous form towering over her. It sniffed the air, its gaze narrowing. You cannot escape your blood, child, it growled. You are one of us. But Lily, despite the overwhelming fear, did not back down. I'm not, she said firmly, her voice trembling but resolute. I won't be part of your curse anymore. The pack circled her, their growls low and menacing, but something shifted in the air. The eclipse had arrived, and Lily knew the moment had come. She had to make the final choice. In that instant, with the moon's shadow cast upon the world, Lily made her decision. She would stop the ritual, not by running or hiding, but by breaking the bond. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the amulet she had found in her grandmother's belongings, the one that had been passed down through generations of her family. It was the key to severing the ancient ties. With trembling hands, she held the amulet high and whispered the incantation her grandmother had taught her. The dogsmen howled in rage as the energy shifted, a wave of force rippling outward from her. And just as the eclipse reached its peak, the pack vanished, fading into the ether, their connection to her blood severed forever. But Lily knew that the darkness wasn't gone. The ritual would return, and the dogsmen would rise again. But next time, someone else would have to face them.